Zuba and Timi Street was like any other small street in Lagos, alive with the sounds of people going about their daily business, children playing, and neighbors sharing gossip. It was a place where everyone knew everyone's name, and no secret stayed hidden for long. At every corner, people greeted each other with a smile or a friendly wave, and no one ever passed by without saying good morning or good afternoon. Among the familiar faces was Papa So, the elderly man who had lived on Zuba and Timi Street for as long as anyone could remember. Every morning, he sat outside his small bungalow, his transistor radio playing softly as he sipped from his cup of hot pape. His bungalow, painted a fading shade of yellow, stood out with its neatly swept compound and the scent of flowers from his small garden. Papa Anso wasn't just another resident, he was the unofficial watchman of the street. If something unusual was happening, you could be sure that Papa Anso would be the first to notice and the first to spread the news. There was also Adais, a young woman who helped her mother run a small provision shop on the street. Adais was known for her quick smile and friendly attitude. Udi, she greeted everyone who walked past, and if you didn't greet her back, she'd call after you. Ah, brother, you no fit greet. Her cheerful voice echoed in the mornings as she arranged goods in front of the shop, the scent of freshly baked bread wafting through the air. At the end of the street stood a small Amala joint run by Mama Itoro. Though new to the area, she had quickly become a part of the Zuba and Timi Street community. From the day she arrived, her cooking had drawn in a crowd. Her Amala, Gebegiri, and Yudu were so good that people came from nearby streets just to get a taste. The wooden benches outside the shop were often filled with customers, their laughter mingling with the aroma of spices. But as peaceful as Zuba and Timi Street appeared, something strange was happening, something that nobody but the dogs seemed to notice. Mr. Ekenem, who lived in the house right next to the Amala shop, had two large dogs. Normally, they were quiet and friendly, wagging their tails at familiar faces and barking only when strangers passed by. But ever since Mama Itoro and her family arrived, the dogs had changed. Every time they passed the dog's gate, the animals barked fiercely, growling and pacing, as though they were in the presence of something dangerous. At first, Mr. Ekenem thought it was just the dogs being protective of their territory. But soon, it became clear that something was unsettling the animals. The more the family came and went from the shop, the more agitated the dogs became. Their barking often started just as the sun was setting, echoing through the street and making the neighbors glance uneasily at one another. At first, nobody took note of the dogs barking. For months after they arrived, Mama Itoro's Amala joint was the most popular place on Zuba and Timi Street. From the early hours of the morning, the smell of hot Amala cooking on the stove would fill the air, drawing people in like bees to honey. It wasn't just the food that people loved, it was the atmosphere. There was something comforting about sitting on the wooden benches outside the small shop, eating a plate of Amala with gebegiri and assorted meats, and watching the world go by. Mama Itoro was a short, plump woman, always with a smile on her face and a warm greeting for everyone who passed by. She worked alongside her two daughters and a young man, whom many assumed was her son. The girls were quiet, always working quickly and efficiently, while the boy handled the money and served the customers. Together, they ran the joint like a well-oiled machine. People from all over the area came to buy food. Papa so made it a point to stop by at least twice a week, He liked to sit on the benches outside, listening to his radio and enjoying his meal. Even Adaise, who was always busy at her mother's shop, would find time to stop by and grab a plate. "This Amala is magic," she'd say, licking her fingers after every meal. Even though the family didn't talk much, people felt at ease around them. They never caused any trouble, and they kept their shop clean and tidy. It was the perfect business, and it seemed like nothing could go wrong. The amala was soft, the gebigiri was perfectly seasoned, and the customers were happy. But while the people of Zuba and Timi Street enjoyed their meals without a second thought, Mr. Ekanem's dogs had a different opinion. Every time Mama Itoro or one of her children walked past, the dogs would bark furiously, their sharp barks cutting through the air. They seemed to sense something that the rest of the street couldn't. "I don't know why these dogs keep barking at them," Mr. Ekanem said one day, shaking his head. "They've never acted like this before." His dogs were usually calm and friendly. They'd seen the family every day for months, and yet their reaction never changed. Every time the family passed by, the barking started up again, as if the dogs were warning the street about something no one else could see. "If only these dogs could talk," Mr. Ekanem muttered to himself one evening as the dogs barked uncontrollably once again. But to everyone else, Mama Itoro and her family seemed perfectly ordinary. They ran their shop, greeted their customers, and went about their business like everyone else. Nobody thought twice about it. As the days went by, however, something subtle began to change. The joint was still busy, but there was a growing unease in the air that nobody could quite explain. Little by little, things started to feel different. At first, the changes were so small that nobody really noticed. People still came to Mama Itoro's Amala joint, enjoyed their meals, and exchanged small talk as they ate. The joint remained as popular as ever. But slowly, something started to shift. The warmth that used to fill the small shop began to fade, and the family's behavior became more distant, more unsettling. It began with the greetings. Mama Itoro had always been one of the most polite people on the street. Every morning, she would greet everyone who passed by her shop, her voice full of energy, her smile bright. Her two daughters and the young man who worked with her would always follow her lead, nodding and greeting the customers as they set up for the day. It was something that everyone on Zuba and Timi Street appreciated. Greetings were an essential part of the culture. But one day, Adaise noticed something odd. She passed by the shop on her way to the provision store, as she always did, and waved at Mama Itoro. "Good morning, Mama Itoro." She called out cheerfully, but this time there was no reply. Mama Itoro didn't look up, didn't smile. She didn't even seem to hear Adaise. Adaise frowned. Maybe she didn't hear me, she thought. So she tried again the next day. This time, the same thing happened, no response. Mama Itoro's daughters, usually quick to greet, just continued with their work, their faces blank, their eyes avoiding contact with anyone who passed. It wasn't just Adaise. Other people on the street started to notice as well. One by one, they began to whisper among themselves. The air felt heavier, as if the street itself had become burdened with an invisible weight. Papa Anso, who sat outside his house every day listening to his radio, noticed the change too. "These people have stopped greeting," he said one afternoon, scratching his head. "Before, they would greet me every morning. Now, They just walk by like they don't see me. I thought it was just me. Adaze replied, I greet them every day, but they act like I'm invisible. At first, people tried to make excuses for them. Maybe they were tired. Running an Amala joint wasn't easy, after all. But the strange behavior continued, and as the days went by, the family became even more withdrawn. The once lively chatter that used to spill out from the shop was replaced by an eerie silence that made even the busiest days feel unsettling. They no longer spoke to the customers the way they used to. They served the food, took the money, and went back to their work in silence. Even when the shop was busy, the atmosphere felt cold, almost eerie. The warm smiles that had once greeted everyone were gone, replaced by a rigid politeness that felt rehearsed. And the dogs, Mr. Ekenem's dogs, noticed it too. If anyone should have gotten used to Mama Itoro's family, it was the dogs. They saw them every day, heard their voices, and watched them move back and forth from the house to the shop. But instead of growing accustomed to their presence, the dogs seemed more agitated than ever. Every morning, when Mama Itoro and her children passed by on their way to open the shop, the dogs would bark furiously. Their growls were low and menacing, their barks sharp and relentless. They barked so loudly that it disturbed the entire street. It wasn't just one bark and then silence, it was continuous, as if the dogs were trying to send a message. A warning? I don't know what's wrong with these dogs, Mr. Ekenem muttered one evening, shaking his head in frustration. They've never acted like this before. Every day it's the same thing. As soon as that family walks by, they go crazy. It wasn't normal, and Mr. Ekenem knew it. His dogs had always been friendly, calm even, around strangers. But something about Mama Itoro's family was different. Adiziz, standing outside her mother's provision shop, watched the scene unfold one morning. The dogs barked violently, pacing back and forth behind the gate, their eyes locked on the family as they passed by. Yet Mama Itoro and her children didn't seem bothered at all. They didn't flinch, didn't even look in the direction of the dogs. They walked silently to the shop, opened the door, and began their day as usual. What is it with these dogs? Adaez asked, turning to her mother, who stood beside her. I don't know, but it's not normal. Dogs don't bark like that for no reason. As the days turned into weeks, the whispers on Zuba and Timi Street grew louder. People who had once adored the Amala joint now felt uneasy. The food was still as delicious as ever, but the warmth and friendliness that had once defined the place were gone. The shop was busy, but it felt cold, lifeless. Customers noticed that the family barely spoke to each other anymore, and when they did, it was in hushed tones in a language nobody on the street recognized. They're not Yoruba, Papan, so said one day, speaking to a group of men who gathered outside his house. I've been listening to them, and the language they speak, it's not Yoruba, it's not Hausa or Igbo either. I don't know what it is. The men nodded in agreement. It was another strange piece of the puzzle that nobody could figure out. The conversations grew more speculative, each theory more far-fetched than the last. As the mystery deepened, so did the tension on Zuba and Timi Street. The dogs continued their relentless barking, and people continued to whisper, wondering what had changed. Why had the family become so distant? Why were the dogs so disturbed by them? Was there something they were hiding? Nobody had the answers, but one thing was clear: something was wrong with the Amala cellars. The people couldn't see it, but the dogs could. And if only they knew what the dogs were trying to say. As the weeks passed, the unease on Zuba and Timi Street grew stronger. Mama Itoro's Amala joint, once the bustling center of the neighborhood, still drew customers, but people began to speak in hushed tones about the strange changes that had taken over the family. There was something odd about the way they lived, something that didn't sit right with anyone who paid attention. For one thing, people began to realize that Mama Itoro and her family never seemed to leave the shop. At first, everyone had assumed they had a house somewhere nearby, that they lived like everyone else in the neighborhood. But as time went on, it became clear that the family actually lived in the small restaurant itself. The shop wasn't large, just a single room with a kitchen at the back, and it had no windows. Yet every night, after they closed up, the family would stay inside and nobody ever saw them leave. It didn't make sense. Lagos was known for its sweltering heat, especially during the dry season. On nights when the temperature soared, when even the wind refused to blow, people on Zuba and Timi Street would drag their mattresses outside, hoping to catch a breeze. Mr. Econom's compound was always filled with people sleeping in the open air, trying to escape the stifling heat inside their homes. But not Mama Itoro's family. No matter how hot it got, they stayed inside the shop. People began to whisper that the family must have a way to cool the place down, maybe a fan or an air conditioner. But that theory didn't hold water. Everyone knew there was no light in the shop after hours. And besides, the building had no windows for any cool air to circulate. Yet somehow, the family appeared comfortable while everyone else on the street sweated through the night. "They never come outside," Adaye's said one evening, standing by the gate of Mr. Econom's compound with her mother. "It's so hot, and they stay inside that small shop like nothing is happening." "It's not normal," her mother replied, shaking her head. "Even me, I can't sleep in this kind of heat." The more people talked, the more they realized how strange the family's living arrangements were. The shop had no windows, no proper ventilation, and an unusual heaviness seemed to linger in the air. Even during the day, when the sun was at its highest, the family would stay inside, cooking and working as if they didn't feel the heat at all. It was as though they were untouched by the things that affected everyone else on the street. The faint smell of incense often drifted from the shop, adding another layer to the mystery. And then there were the dogs. It was unusual because, typically, dogs in the neighborhood grew accustomed to the people they saw every day. After a while, they stopped barking at familiar faces. But with this family, it was different. "I don't understand it," Mr. Econom said one afternoon, talking to a few neighbors who had gathered outside his house. "My dogs have never acted like this. They should be used to that family by now. But every time they see them, it's like they're seeing strangers." "It's not just your dogs," Papa Anso added, sitting on his usual chair and tapping his walking stick on the ground. "Dogs can sense things we can't. They're seeing something that we're not seeing. Maybe it's the incense or something else." The neighbors nodded in agreement. Everyone had their theories, but nobody could explain why the dogs were so agitated. Some whispered about the strange language the family often spoke, a tongue no one could identify, adding to the growing list of oddities. The constant barking had become a daily routine. Every time the family passed by, the dogs would growl and bark until they disappeared into the shop. And even then, the dogs would continue to pace near the gate, uneasy and restless. The mystery deepened. Who were these people? Where did they come from? And why did everything about them feel so off? As the whispers grew louder, so did the tension. People still came to the shop, but they came with a sense of unease, as though something unseen was lurking just beneath the surface. The dim lighting inside the shop, paired with the smell of burning incense, made customers feel like they were stepping into another world, a world that didn't quite belong to Zuba and Timi Street. The family's strange living conditions, the dog's constant barking, and the unfamiliar language all pointed to one thing: there was more to Mama Itoro's family than met the eye. And while the people of Zuba and Timi Street tried to make sense of it, the dogs kept barking whenever they sighted any member of the strange family. Things went on like this until New Year's Eve, when something unexpected happened. The end of the year brought a festive atmosphere to Zuba and Timi Street. The air was filled with the sounds of celebration, children running around with sparklers, families setting up chairs in front of their homes, and the smell of food wafting from kitchens as everyone prepared for the new year. The hum of excitement was palpable, yet the unease surrounding Mama Itoro's family lingered like a shadow. As was tradition, most of the residents stayed up for the crossover into the new year, either attending church or celebrating with family and friends. Laughter and music filled the streets, but even in the revelry, some couldn't help but glance toward Mama Itoro's shop, its faintly glowing lights piercing the night. But as the neighborhood prepared for the celebrations, one thing stood out: Mama Itoro's Amala shop was still open late into the night. It was unusual for the shop to be open so late. Normally, Mama Itoro closed up around 900 p.m., but on this particular night, the lights inside the shop stayed on, and the family could be seen moving about, cooking and serving food to the few late-night customers. Some people on the street wondered if they were staying open longer to make some extra money before the new year, but nobody questioned it. After all, Mama Itoro's family had always done things differently. Mr. Kanem, who had just returned from a New Year's Eve service with his wife, noticed the lights still on in the shop as he passed by. "Ah, they're still open," his wife asked, surprised. "Maybe they're trying to make some extra sales before midnight," Mr. Ekanem replied, glancing at the shop. The faint glow from the lights inside cast long, eerie shadows on the street. The dogs, however, were unusually quiet that night. Normally, they would bark at the family whenever they passed by, but on this particular night, they seemed calm, lying quietly in Mr. Ekanem's compound. It was strange, but Mr. Ekanem didn't think much of it at the time. As the clock struck midnight, the sounds of fireworks filled the sky, and the people of Zuba and Timi Street celebrated the arrival of the new year. There was laughter, music, and the clinking of bottles as neighbors wished each other well and made plans for the year ahead. But in the midst of the celebrations, nobody paid much attention to Mama Itoro's shop. By the next morning, everything changed. When the sun rose on New Year's Day, the people of Zuba and Timi Street were met with an unsettling sight. Mama Itoro's shop, which had been buzzing with activity just hours before, was completely empty. The door was closed, the lights were off, and there was no sign of the family. It wasn't just that they had closed for the holiday, everything was gone. The pots and pans that had always been stacked outside the shop were missing. The benches where customers usually sat had been cleared away. Inside, the shop was bare, as if no one had ever been there. I passed by there around 2 a.m. after the service, and they were still there, Mr. Ekanem said, shaking his head in disbelief. But now it's like they disappeared. Adaeze was one of the first to notice the disappearance when she went to buy Amala that morning. Mama Itoro, are you there? She called out, knocking on the door. Her voice echoed unnervingly in the silence, but there was no answer. When she peeked inside, she was shocked to find the shop completely empty. She ran back to her mother's shop, her heart racing. Mama, they're gone. The shop is empty. Her mother frowned. What do you mean gone? They're not there. Everything is gone. The whole place is cleared out. News of the disappearance spread quickly across Zuba and Timi Street. Neighbors gathered around the empty shop, whispering to one another, trying to make sense of it. Nobody had seen them pack up or leave, no trucks, no cars, nothing. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. They couldn't have just left without anyone noticing, one man said, scratching his head. Maybe they moved in the middle of the night, another suggested. But how could they clear everything out so quickly and quietly? But no one could explain how they had left without a trace. The shop was completely bare, and there were no clues as to where the family had gone. No witnesses, no evidence, just an empty shop and unanswered questions. Even the faint scent of spices that used to cling to the air around the shop had disappeared, leaving nothing but the sterile smell of dust and neglect. As the days passed, the disappearance of Mama Itoro and her family became the main topic of conversation on Zuba and Timi Street. People who had once gathered at the Amala joint to share a meal now gathered outside the empty shop to speculate about what had happened. The sun-baked pavement in front of the shop became a makeshift meeting place, with clusters of people standing in the shade of nearby trees, exchanging hushed theories. Everyone had a theory. Some believed that the family were ghost spirits who had once lived on Zuba and Timi Street long ago. They pointed to the family's strange behavior, their refusal to greet, the way they lived inside the shop with no windows, and the language they spoke that nobody could understand. To them, it made sense. The family had never belonged to the living world, and now they had returned to wherever they came from. You know, there are old stories about this area. One of the older women on the street said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It's possible that they were spirits and they only came back for a short time. Maybe they had unfinished business. Others thought the family was running from something, perhaps death or some unknown danger that had finally caught up with them. They speculated that the family had been living on the run for years, moving from place to place, never staying in one location for too long. The way they had packed up so suddenly, leaving no trace, seemed to fit this narrative. Maybe they had been recognized by someone, or maybe they had gotten into trouble, and that's why they left in such a hurry. Someone suggested. They must have been scared of something big. I wouldn't be surprised if they owed someone money, one man said, shaking his head. People don't just disappear like that unless they're running from something. But Papa nursed they're running from something. But Papa and So, always the voice of reason, had a different theory. He believed the family's strange behavior could be explained by mental health issues. Look, it's possible they were struggling, he said one afternoon, sitting with a few of the neighbors under the shade of a mango tree. The way they refused to greet, the way they lived in that small shop, without windows, it could be that something was wrong with them. Maybe they needed help. The neighbors nodded, considering his words. It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't answer all the questions. The stillness in the air around the shop and the lingering unease in the pit of Adaise's stomach suggested there was more to the story. What about the dogs? Someone asked. For months, Mr. Eckenham's dogs had barked relentlessly at the family, growling and pacing every time they passed by. But since the family's disappearance, the dogs had been calm, not a single bark. It was as if the source of their agitation had vanished along with the family. It's strange, Mr. Eckenham said, watching the dogs laze around in the yard. They haven't barked once since that family left. It's like whatever was bothering them is gone now. The fact that the dogs were no longer barking only fueled the rumors that the family had been something more than human. The way the dogs now sprawled in the sun, their eyes half closed in contentment, made the whole street feel even more surreal. Maybe the dogs knew all along, Adayes whispered to her friend. Maybe they were trying to warn us. As the weeks passed, life on Zuba and Timi Street slowly returned to normal. The noise and bustle of the neighborhood continued, and people went back to their daily routines. The empty shop, where Mama Itoro once served Amala, remained vacant, a silent reminder of the mystery that had taken place. Dust began to collect on the faded sign above the shop's door, and weeds sprouted in the cracks of the pavement outside. But the story of Mama Itoro lingered in the air like a ghost haunting the street. Adaise, who had once visited the shop every day, could stop thinking about the family. Where had they gone? Would she ever see them again? She walked past the empty shop every morning on her way to her mother's store, always half expecting to see the family return. Sometimes she would pause and peer through the dusty glass of the shop door, as if hoping to catch a glimpse of something, anything that might explain their disappearance. As for Mr. Eckenham, he still found it strange that his dogs were back to their old calm selves. For months, they had barked endlessly at the family, but now they lay quietly in the yard as if nothing had ever happened. On quiet afternoons, when the street was still, he would sit outside and watch them, wondering if they had sensed something he could not. In the end, the mystery of Mama Itoro and her family remained unsolved. Whether they had been ghosts, struggling with mental health, or simply running from their past, no one could say for sure. The people of Zuba and Timi Street had their theories, but the truth remained elusive. Life went on, but the story of the Amala sellers would never be forgotten. The story of Mama Itoro and her family teaches us a valuable lesson: never judge people or situations solely by their appearance. The strange behaviors, changes in attitude, and especially the unusual reactions of the dogs, reveal that there is often more to a story than meets the eye. This reminds us to trust our instincts, Pay attention to small but unusual signs and not ignore warnings whether they come from people or nature. Moreover, the story highlights the importance of community unity. A supportive and connected community that communicates and acts together can uncover hidden dangers and provide help where it is most needed. Thank you for watching this video. If you found the story interesting and meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to explore more fascinating stories. See you in the next video. All it took was one spray of the perfume, and Boma realized that some gifts are better left unopened. Once upon a time, there lived a beautiful woman who lived and worked in the big city. Her name was Tini, and she was greatly loved by those around her. Her smile lit up rooms like the first rays of dawn breaking through the night, and her laughter was so infectious it seemed to dance through the air, lifting everyone's spirits. One day, Teeny returned home from work, her heels clicking against the polished floors of her apartment hallway, and met a gift sitting outside her door. She picked it up, her perfectly manicured fingers tracing the edges of the box, and wondered who could have sent it. She walked into her house, scanning through the package to see if there was a note attached with a name, but all she found was a simple card that read, "May the aura of this perfume bring you the attention that you deserve." The perfume bottle was unique, a crystal glass with a golden nozzle that shimmered under her warm bedroom light, casting tiny rainbows on the walls. Teeny smiled, assuming it was from a secret admirer or a client who was only expressing gratitude. Curiosity got the better part of her, and without hesitation, she pressed the nozzle and sprayed it lightly on her neck. The fragrance was divine at first, a sweet blend of jasmine and sandalwood that filled the room like an ethereal presence. Teeny inhaled deeply, savoring the scent, but then her nose twitched and her eyes began to water slightly. Something felt off, like a faint whisper of warning in the back of her mind, but Teeny brushed it off as stress. She dropped the perfume on her dresser, its intricate design glinting under the lamp, and got herself ready for bed, knowing how busy her morning was going to be. When morning came, Teeny woke up feeling odd. There was a terrible smell in her room, thick and suffocating, and she could not help but ask herself where the smell was coming from. As she walked into the bathroom to freshen up, the smell heightened and Teeny realized that it was coming from her. "Did I poop on myself or something?" she thought to herself as she took a long bath, scrubbing herself until her skin hurt. But the smell persisted, foul and pungent, like stagnant water mixed with rotten eggs. When she arrived at work, her colleagues could not help but notice the horrible smell. "Is there a dead rat somewhere?" someone whispered, as another revealed that it smelled like sewage. Teeny recoiled in her chair, her heart sinking as she pondered why she was smelling. A colleague approached her, holding her nose softly. "Teeny, I think something might be wrong. Should we go see a doctor?" she said to Teeny, whose eyes brimmed with embarrassment. Feeling so humiliated, Teeny rushed home to take another bath. No matter how many baths she took or how much expensive perfume she sprayed on her skin, the smell only grew worse, clinging to her like a shadow. That evening, as she sat at home, crying, her boyfriend Ayo decided to pay her a visit. They had been dating for a year, and Teeny hoped that he would provide some form of comfort to her. But as soon as he entered her apartment, he gagged and covered his nose. What's that smell, Teeny? Please, I don't know what's happening to me, Teeny pleaded. Ayo stepped back, his face twisted in disgust. You smell like a dead corpse. What did you do to smell this terribly? He asked Teeny, who stood there heartbroken to hear such hurtful words from him. Ayo could not hide his discomfort. He held his nose tightly, gagging as he tried not to vomit. Teeny pleaded with him not to go, but Ayo warned her to stay away from him. Until you fix yourself, I don't want to see you anywhere around me, Ayo said as he walked out of her house, leaving her alone with her shame. Teeny could not contain her hurt. She called her best friend Dara, who arrived at her home a few hours later. Dara met Teeny broken and in tears. She assured Teeny that everything would be fine, though she could not help but notice the stench that came from her friend. When did this all begin? Dara asked Teeny, who narrated everything to her. She pointed at the perfume, which was still sitting on her dresser. I believe the perfume is behind everything that's happening, Teeny said to her friend. Dara walked towards the dresser and picked up the perfume bottle. She stared at it for a brief moment, the golden nozzle catching the dim light, and smashed it to the ground. The contents evaporated before their eyes as Dara stared at the shattered remains on the floor. The golden shards glittered under the faint light, but the foul stench in the air remained as thick and suffocating as ever. It's gone now, Teeny, Dara said softly, turning back to her friend. Whatever curse was in that bottle should be broken by now, but Teeny could still smell it. It clung to her skin, her hair, and her very soul. Dara, what if it's not just the perfume? What if it's me? Teeny's voice broke as tears ran down her cheeks. Dara hugged her tightly, though she flinched slightly as the smell assaulted her senses. No, Teeny, it's not you. We'll figure this out together, okay? You're not alone. That night, Dara stayed with Teeny. They barely slept as Teeny cried herself into exhaustion. Later that night, Teeny woke up to a faint sound of Dara talking to someone on the phone. I'm so happy it worked. It worked, Dara whispered on the phone as she thanked the unknown person for coming up with such a great plan. Teeny stood there, shocked as she wondered what Dara was talking about. She returned to her bed and pretended to be asleep, her heart pounding in her chest. As Dara stood silently in the doorway, Teeny could swear that she saw something cold and calculating in her friend's eyes. She squeezed her eyes shut, her mind racing with questions she had no answers to. What did she mean by, I'm happy it worked? Who was she talking to? Could Dara have done this to me? Teeny thought to herself, deeply unable to sleep. By morning she had Dara leave the house in a hurry, and this heightened her suspicion as she wondered why Dara was acting so strangely. Hours passed, and Teeny could not take her mind off the call. She sat in her living room alone, her mind swelling with thoughts as she heard a knock on her door. Teeny wondered who it could be. With trembling hands, she opened the door and saw Sola, who was standing there with a smile on his face. Sola was a man from her past who had always been kind to her. For years he had expressed his love for her, but Teeny had never felt the same way about him. Still, they remained friends before life pulled them in different directions. Teeny had not seen Sola in 2 years and was shocked to see him at her door. Sola's face was a mix of concern and shock as he stepped into the house. The stench hit him immediately as he tried to hold his breath. Teeny, what happened here? What is that smell? He asked. Teeny burst out in tears in front of him. Sola could not stand to see her cry. He urged her to narrate the entire story to him, and Teeny began to narrate all that happened. Sola sat beside her, ignoring the stench, as he listened to her heart-touching story. Through choking sobs, she told him everything about the perfume, the